Dartmoor, one of the most enigmatic locations in England, is a labyrinth of narrow roads shrouded in a mist that seems never to lift. During the day, the rolling hills offer a rugged beauty, but at night, everything changes. The landscape transforms into an oppressive scene where darkness swallows the headlights of cars, and each bend holds a mystery. It was an especially cold night when Thomas, a young delivery driver, took the road that cut through the heart of Dartmoor. He drove in silence, the radio picking up only static while the wind hissed through the twisted trees. Dried leaves rustled on the asphalt as if pushed by invisible hands. Thomas had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Dartmoor had heard of the girl in the white dress. Some say she asks for help, others swear she simply watches, with eyes that seem to see beyond the human realm. But everyone agrees on one thing: she never ages. As he drove, Thomas noticed something by the roadside. At first glance, it looked like a person, small and motionless. His heart raced. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, forcing a smile that quickly vanished. The figure moved. He caught a glimpse of a white dress fluttering in the cold breeze. The air in the car grew heavier. There was something in the way she moved, slow and deliberate, that made him hesitate to slow down. But what truly froze his blood was her face, or rather, the lack of expression. There was no emotion, just a vacant stare that seemed to pierce through him like blades. The shadow of mystery lingered. Should he continue or stop? Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening as he passed slowly by the figure. He tried to ignore her, but the rear-view mirror seemed to pull his gaze back. There she was, standing by the roadside, her white dress glowing in the faint light of the rear headlights. Logic told him to keep going. "It's just a child. Someone must have left her here," he thought. But another part of him knew something was wrong. The silence in the car seemed to swell, almost palpable, except for the sound of the engine, which now seemed louder than it should. Suddenly, the figure vanished from the rearview mirror. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced quickly back, but the road was empty. He let out a nervous sigh and returned his gaze to the road, but his relief was interrupted by a dull sound. Thump! Thump! The sound came from the back of the car. It sounded like a persistent tapping, as if someone were knocking on the rear window. Thomas tried to ignore it, but the knocks grew louder, rhythmic, almost demanding. He blinked rapidly, sweat trickling down his temples, even in the cold. Fear compelled him to accelerate. The knocks stopped for a moment, only to be replaced by something even worse. A laugh, low, almost imperceptible, but filled with a strange glee. It was as if someone were right behind him, whispering their macabre amusement. Trying to control his panic, he turned on the radio, but all he could get was static, until the static began to form words. "You shouldn't have ignored me." Thomas lost control for a moment, the car skidding on the wet road. He held on, gasping, but dared not stop. The laughter ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of tires on the road. When he looked again in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. The girl was sitting in the back seat. Her face, pale and expressionless, was fixed on him with eyes that seemed like black holes. He didn't know what to do. Keep driving? Confront her? Something worse was about to happen. Thomas couldn't tear his eyes from the mirror. The girl was there, motionless, like a materialized shadow. He tried to say something, but his throat felt dry, unable to produce sound. The silence in the car was thick, as if the air had been drained. The girl slightly tilted her head, a nearly imperceptible gesture. But it made Thomas's heart pound even harder. He knew something was terribly wrong. His fingers trembled as they gripped the wheel, and every mile seemed eternal. Suddenly, the lights along the road began to flicker. First one, then another, until darkness enveloped everything except the faint light of the headlights. The road seemed to stretch before him, as if he were trapped in an endless loop. The car began to vibrate slightly, and Thomas realized the temperature inside the vehicle had dropped. His breath was now visible, forming small clouds in the icy air. The girl, however, seemed untouched by the cold. "Who are you?" he finally managed to whisper, not expecting an answer. But she replied. Without moving her lips, he heard her voice in his mind, clear as a bell. "I just want help. Why didn't you stop for me?" Thomas tried to justify himself, but his mind was in disarray. The car began to lose speed, even with the accelerator pressed down. The engine roared in protest, but the force holding him back was invisible, uncontrollable. He glanced back at the rear seat. The girl was no longer there. The seat was empty. He jerked the wheels sharply, the car skidding, but he kept steady on the road. It was then he saw her again, this time standing in the middle of the road, her arms extended as if asking for a hug. Thomas braked instinctively, but the figure did not disappear. He braced for impact, but at the moment he should have hit her. She dissolved into a cloud of smoke. A shrill sound cut through the air. The radio came back to life, but what was playing was not music. It was a children's song, distorted and ghostly. The car came to a complete halt. The engine died as if sucked into an invisible force, and the children's song continued to echo, now louder and more disturbing, filled with distortions and crackles. Thomas was frozen, his hands glued to the wheel, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The road ahead seemed warped, the outlines of trees moving like living shadows. The mist thickened, enveloping the car in a damp, cold cocoon. Thomas tried to restart the engine, but the key turned in vain. He didn't know if it was the cold or the fear that made his hands shake. In the silence, only broken by the music, Thomas heard a different sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the car. They came from all sides, as if something was surrounding the vehicle. He turned his head to look around, but could see nothing beyond the mist that seemed alive, pulsating to the rhythm of the footsteps. Then he felt it, a cold, damp touch on the driver's window. He turned abruptly and saw the mark of a small hand, as if a child had just pressed against it. Thomas swallowed dryly, his heart pounding so fast that he thought it might explode. The girl's voice echoed again in his mind. "Why didn't you stop? I just wanted help." This time there was a mix of sadness and anger in her words, like an open wound demanding attention. The driver's side window began to fog up, and a word was slowly written on the glass, as if someone were writing from the outside. "Help me." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, she was there. The girl in the white dress stood by the car, her face pale and empty, but her eyes, now they seemed hungry, like bottomless wells drawing in the souls of those who dared to gaze into them. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. However, the girl didn't need permission. She passed through the glass like a spectre ignoring physical barriers and appeared in the passenger seat. The air around her was so cold that Thomas felt his lips crack instantly. "You need to understand," she whispered now with an audible voice. "I can't leave until someone knows the truth." Thomas, trembling, asked, "What truth? What do you want from me?" The girl slowly turned her face towards him, and for a moment Thomas saw something beyond the emptiness. Pain, deep and rooted. "I died here. I was left alone. No one stopped, and no one ever will." Suddenly, the road around them changed. Thomas was now in a different scene, as if he had been transported to the past. He saw an old car parked by the roadside. A man was getting out, shouting in anger, and a girl was crying in the back seat. He watched the same child being pushed out of the car, left alone in the thickening mist. The man walked away without looking back, leaving her there. Thomas felt her despair as if it were his own. He jolted back to the present, reality returning around him. "You were abandoned," he murmured. The girl nodded, tears streaming down her pale face. "And now I stay here, waiting, always waiting." Thomas felt a wave of compassion mixed with terror. He knew he had to do something, but what? "How can I help you?" The girl's face changed. For a brief moment, she looked more human, almost innocent again. "Take me home." Thomas hesitated. He knew that home could mean something much darker than a physical address. But looking into her eyes, he saw a glimmer of hope, or perhaps relief. He nodded. "Tell me where it is." The girl smiled faintly, but at the same time, the temperature dropped even more. The radio began to emit static again, but among the noise, Thomas heard a voice that wasn't hers. "You're making a mistake." Something else was on the road. Something that didn't want him to help her. Thomas took a deep breath, fighting the dread that consumed every fiber of his being. He turned to the girl beside him, waiting for her to say something, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The fog around them seemed to thrum, as if something invisible was approaching, growing closer. "Where is your home?" he asked again, his voice trembling, almost a whisper. The girl pointed ahead, towards the endless darkness of the road. "Keep driving," she said, her voice soft but laden with something Thomas couldn't decipher. He turned the key in the ignition, and to his surprise, the engine responded. The car's lights came on, illuminating only a small stretch of road that seemed to stretch infinitely. Thomas began to drive, feeling that each meter took him deeper into an abyss from which he might never escape. As the car moved forward, the atmosphere shifted again. The road seemed to pulse beneath the tires, and the outlines of the trees around them became more grotesque, like shadows of something that should never exist. "We're almost there," the girl said suddenly, breaking the silence. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He saw a grand old mansion in the distance, its windows black as empty eyes. It was an imposing structure, but abandoned, with vines covering its walls and a palpable sense that time had stopped there. "This is it," she said. Thomas stopped the car, his breath heavy. "And now?" The girl turned to him, her face illuminated by an expression of gratitude. "You did what no one else did. You stopped." Before he could respond, she began to fade, like smoke being carried away by the wind. The air around grew warm again, and the oppressive weight lifted. The road was silent, normal, as if nothing had happened. But when Thomas looked at the house, the windows now glowed with a faint light, as if something had been awakened. In that moment, he knew the girl had finally found peace, or perhaps something far more sinister had been unleashed. Lacking the courage to approach the mansion, Thomas remained in the car for a few minutes, watching the illuminated windows. The light was faint, pulsing, almost as if it were alive. He wondered if he should go there, but instinct screamed at him to leave. The adrenaline began to fade, and exhaustion hit him like a wave. He decided to turn back, leaving the mansion and the road behind. The car's engine purred softly, as if the vehicle itself was relieved. However, as he drove on, he realized that something was still wrong. The road didn't look familiar, even though he had just traveled it. The contours of the path seemed different. The trees appeared closer and the fog thicker. He checked the clock on the dashboard, but the display flickered erratically, unable to keep time. A chill ran down his spine. In the distance, he saw a small point of light in the middle of the road. As he approached, he recognized the silhouette of a car parked on the shoulder. He slowed down, and his heart nearly stopped when he realized it was his car. Thomas rushed out, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the darkness. He went to the parked car and saw in the driver's seat a lifeless figure. It was himself. "No, this can't be happening," he murmured, feeling despair swell within him. Behind him, a soft laugh echoed. He turned quickly to see the girl again, but this time she was different. Her face was darker, her eyes completely black. "You thought you helped me, but the truth is, we never leave here," she said, her voice reverberating like 1,000 echoes. No one escapes Dartmoor. Thomas tried to run, but the road seemed to stretch infinitely before him. The world around him warped, and the last thing he heard was the girl's laughter, now sounding as if it came from within his own mind. Days later, local residents reported seeing an abandoned car on the road with small, strange handprints on the glass. The lights were flickering intermittently, and a figure was spotted in the distance, wearing a white dress and waving to passing drivers.